Yeah.
I don't want to end on the dark note then, so I'm going to tell. So I want to tell a little happier story. This begins in Spain, but it doesn't stay in Spain because this story happened back when all of the Jews were driven out of Spain. There were millions of people driven out of Spain, part of the Reconquest and all these really dark things that were happening in Spain at the time, this Inquisition. And so one of the many people driven out of Spain was Jacobo and his wife Esperanza. And so people went all over when they were driven out of Spain. Some people went north, east, south, and a lot of people went back to the Holy Land. And that's exactly what Jacobo and Esperanza did. They all went back to Israel, back to Palestine, to the Holy Land. So they went there and they found a house and they rented and they found a synagogue and they were very devout. Now, Jacobo, he was a sort of a pot-bellied, short, stocky man. His wife made excellent bread. She was the best baker he'd ever known. And he was a fine, really nice man, had that twinkle in his eyes. But when you said Jacobo's name, you said devout, because he was extremely devout. Every Sabbath, you'd see him in the synagogue, and he'd be sitting there, and he'd be paying really close attention to the rabbi's sermon. And that was unusual, because he didn't understand a word of the rabbi's sermon. Because the rabbi spoke Hebrew, and Jacobo spoke Yiddish, and he spoke Ladino, the language of the Jews from Spain. But he would sit there, he knew a little bit of Hebrew. He could read a little bit of the old sacred language. And so he'd scrunch up his face and he'd try to understand what the rabbi was saying. And one day he was in the synagogue and he heard the rabbi. There were two words in the whole sermon. It was a long sermon too. It was like a 40-minute thing. And there were two words he understood. It was one of the ways to refer to God, Adonai or Hashem. Because of course you never said the sacred name of God. But this was a way to say the Lord without saying the name, but he knew that. So he knew there was something about God in there. And then he heard lechem, bread. And he left and he thought he understood the sermon. He said, okay, God likes bread. And he got home and he went home to his wife. He said, Esperanza, I just learned something today. God likes bread. You're the best baker in the county. Why don't you make some pan for God? Make some bread for God. And so she did. She'd never heard that God liked bread before. So all of that day and all the next day she was kneading and mixing in the finest ingredients and doing the braided challah loaves. And she made 12 loaves because it was for God. And because the bread was for God, Jacobo went back to the synagogue and he took those 12 loaves and he went up to the ark where they kept the Torah scrolls. And he opened it up and he put the bread inside the ark. And he left it there for God to pick it up whenever it was convenient. And then he went home. And it just so happens that right about that time he went there was when Moshe, who was the older man who would clean up the synagogue, he was getting in to start working. And Moshe went in and he stood before the ark. He'd stand there and pray sometimes before he started working. And he said, Lord, the only thing I want to do is work in this holy place. But they don't have a budget to pay me really. And I don't know, maybe you could give me a miracle. Maybe there's some way you could help out my family. We don't have much. But maybe it's my lack of faith. Maybe there's a miracle waiting for me right now. And he opened up the ark. And there was his miracle. So he took that bread home to his family. Now, Jacobo went back to the synagogue the next day. When he saw the ark was empty, you should have seen the look on his face. And so he went back. He told Esperanza, God likes your bread. Make some more for next Sabbath. And so she did. And the next Sabbath. And the next one. And so 30 years passed. 30 years going along like this. And Jacobo, Esperanza would make the bread, and Jacobo would bring the bread, and Moshe would pick it up out of the ark and take it back home, and everybody was happy. And 30 years passed, and then one day, 30 years later, Jacobo, he went up, put the bread in just like always. Señor Dios, I'm sorry. Sorry your bread's been a little lumpy lately. It's Esperanza's. It's her arthritis. Maybe you could do something for her arthritis. You'd eat better, but I don't tell you how to do your job. And he put the bread there, and he left, and right then Moshe was coming in, and Moshe came up and picked up the bread, looked at it, and said, I hate to bring it up, but your bread's been lumpy lately. But I never mind, I don't want to complain. But it just so happens, but for the first time in 30 years, Jacobo forgot his hat in the synagogue. So he came back and he saw Moshe taking the bread out of the ark. He said, what are you doing? That's God's bread. Don't touch it. And for the first time they encountered each other, and for the first time the rabbi happened to be in the synagogue on that day, and the rabbi saw them, and he saw them messing around the ark. He said, what are you doing? And Jacobo said, I'm bringing God his bread. He said, what are you talking about? God doesn't eat bread? He's been eating Esperanza's bread for 30 years now. And so they all started shouting at each other, and the rabbi starts telling these two men that they're sinful, and it's a holy place, and what are they doing? And they're taking and putting bread back and forth, and they all start crying. And they're all crying because Jacobo, he just wanted to do the right thing, and he's crying because the rabbi's scolding him, and the rabbi's crying because his followers are so confused, and Moshe's crying because that means no more bread for him. And so everybody's crying. And then the door opened, and one of the oldest, wisest men in the village walked in, and he walked up to the rabbi, and he said, don't scold these men. These men are not sinful, they're devout. And then he turned to the men, and he said, now both of you have an even harder task to do from now on. Something even more difficult and more sacred. From now on, and he went to Jacobo, he said, you need to keep bringing the bread, but you need to give that bread directly to Moshe. But know that when you're doing that, you are still giving that bread to God. And he turned to Moshe. And he said, and when you take the bread directly from Jacobo, you are still receiving the bread from God. And both of you will be having a holy, sacred experience. And so it was, and so it still is. Jacobo.